My name is Ella Harrison, and I'm 32 years old. I never imagined my own family would make me feel like a guest in their world, unwanted, invisible. One night at a family gathering, I walked in quietly, only to hear the laughter, the applause, all directed at my sister Lydia. No one noticed me. When I tried to share something of my own, my mother's voice cut through the room. "Don't start dreaming, Ella. Some lights just aren't meant to shine." I smiled, even as those words sank deep. "Then maybe silence is my light," I whispered to myself. Before I share the rest of my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave your location in the comments, hit the like button, and subscribe if you want to hear more family stories about betrayal, hidden strength, and the quiet power of finding your own path. I live in a small apartment on the third floor of a brick building that's seen better days. The paint is chipped, the stairwell creaks, and sometimes the heat barely works in winter. But it's mine, my little corner of the world. When I come home, I'm greeted not by voices or laughter, but by the soft hum of the city outside and the quiet company of my violin. That violin, it isn't fancy. The wood is worn, the strings a little frayed, but it once belonged to my grandfather, Marcus Harrison, the only person who ever looked at me and truly saw me. Late at night, I'll take it out of its case, set my manuscripts aside, and let the bow slide across the strings. The music is often shaky, sometimes haunting, but it reminds me I'm still here, still alive. I spend my days surrounded by paper, drafts, research notes, little scribbles that never quite turn into something finished. I work part-time at a library, and in between shifts I write essays, short stories, anything that lets me make sense of the silence I've carried since childhood. People ask me if it's lonely. Truth is, the silence outside doesn't hurt nearly as much as the silence inside my own family. A few weeks ago, I was invited, or rather expected, to attend a family party. Lydia had just signed a deal with a big fashion house in New York, and my parents wanted to celebrate. The house was full of people, music, champagne glasses clinking, everyone buzzing about her designs. She was radiant, standing in the middle of the room in one of her own creations, while everyone else circled like moths around a flame. I stood off to the side, holding a plate I didn't want, nodding politely at conversations that didn't include me. I tried to share that I'd had an article accepted in a literary journal, a small one, but still a milestone for me. My mother barely looked up. My father just smiled absently and returned to praising Lydia. It's strange how pain doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just sits in your chest heavy and unmoving, while the rest of the world keeps spinning. Later that night, as I left, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. "Ella, don't embarrass yourself with these little projects. Focus on something practical. Leave the spotlight to your sister." I read it 3 times before deleting it. My chest felt tight, but I forced a smile as I walked down the driveway, the night air sharp against my face. And then, just days later, a letter arrived. An official-looking envelope with my name typed neatly across the front. Inside was an invitation to the office of Mr. Barnes, our family's lawyer. The letter said there would be a reading of my grandfather Marcus's will. My heart stopped. I remember holding that paper in my hands, the ink blurring as my eyes filled. Grandpa. It had been nearly a year since we buried him. I could still see him sitting in the garden, a book in his lap, the smell of tobacco and old leather surrounding him. He'd been my refuge, my lighthouse in the storm of family expectations. As I stood in my kitchen, letter trembling in my hands, the words of my mother echoed in my mind. "Don't start dreaming, Ella." But Grandpa had always told me something different. He once gave me a small coin, old and tarnished, and said, "True strength lives in silence, Ella. The kind of silence that doesn't need to shout to be heard." That coin is still in my desk drawer. Some nights I hold it between my fingers, closing my eyes, remembering the way his hand felt on my shoulder, the warmth of his belief in me. Now, with this letter, a new chapter was calling me, though I didn't yet know if it would be salvation or another wound. The morning of the lawyer's meeting came sooner than I expected. I barely slept the night before, lying awake in my tiny apartment, staring at the ceiling, wondering what Grandpa could have possibly left behind. A letter? A keepsake? Nothing at all? My mother's voice kept echoing in my head, her warning not to fool myself. She'd called me 2 days earlier, her tone clipped, almost mocking. "Ella," she said, "don't get your hopes up. Your grandfather adored you, yes, but he wasn't practical. The real inheritance, the meaningful assets, they'll go to Lydia. That's the way it should be." Her words stung, but they didn't surprise me. Still, part of me wondered if maybe Grandpa had left me something small. A book, a watch, something only he and I would understand. That morning, I stood in front of my mirror, pulling on a plain navy dress. I never cared for fashion the way Lydia did. She could step into a room and command attention. I, on the other hand, preferred not to be noticed. I brushed my hair back, touched the small silver coin Grandpa had given me, and slipped it into my pocket. It wasn't jewelry or money, but to me it was priceless. I remember whispering to myself, "Whatever this day brings, I'll carry him with me." As I prepared to leave, memories of my childhood with Grandpa came flooding back. I could see myself at 8 years old, sitting under the old maple tree in his garden with a book too big for my little hands. I'd stumble over the words, frustrated, and he'd sit beside me patiently. He'd never scold or rush me. Instead, he'd point to the sky, the way the light filtered through the leaves, and say, "Silence is where we learn best, Ella. The world speaks quietly if you're willing to listen." He taught me to listen, to the wind, to the ticking of clocks in his study, to the spaces between words. And maybe that's why I became a writer. My family never valued those moments of quiet, but Grandpa did. Back in the present, I walked out of my apartment, my heart racing as I headed to the subway. The city roared around me, but inside I felt strangely calm, almost as if Grandpa was walking beside me. I arrived at the lawyer's office early, sitting in the waiting area, my hands folded tightly in my lap. The walls smelled of old books and polished wood, a scent that reminded me of Grandpa's study. I closed my eyes, breathing it in, feeling anchored by the memory. But even before the reading began, I could feel the weight of my family's eyes on me. My mother, sitting stiffly with her pearls, avoided looking at me. My father offered a curt nod, nothing more. And Lydia, she leaned back in her chair, phone in hand, her lips curved in that practiced smile. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence was enough to remind me where I stood. And yet, in that moment, I remembered another day with Grandpa. It was the summer after Lydia's graduation. She'd been the star of the ceremony. Flowers, photographs, congratulations from everyone. I had sat in the corner of the auditorium, unnoticed. But Grandpa had noticed. He'd slipped into the empty seat beside me, his hand warm on my shoulder. "You're not invisible to me," he whispered. "One day, they'll understand the value of what doesn't shine so loudly." Those words stayed with me, carrying me through countless moments of being overlooked. And now, as I sat waiting for the will to be read, I clung to them like a lifeline. The door opened and Mr. Barnes, the family's lawyer, walked in with a stack of papers in his hand. The room grew quiet, almost reverent. For a brief second, I thought I heard Grandpa's voice in my memory, steady and reassuring. True strength lives in silence. I straightened my shoulders, holding the coin in my pocket. Whatever was about to happen, I knew I wasn't here for wealth or recognition. I was here for him, for the man who believed in me when no one else did. And with that, the story of my grandfather's legacy truly began. That morning, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. My apartment was still half dark, the weak light of dawn barely reaching through the blinds. My navy dress hung neatly against my frame, modest, simple. I wasn't dressing to impress anyone, certainly not my mother or Lydia, but I wanted to look steady, composed. Inside, though, my heart was a mess. On my desk, the silver coin Grandpa had given me all those years ago caught a sliver of light. I picked it up, felt the cool metal against my palm, and let his words echo in my head again. True strength lives in silence. That coin had traveled with me through college, through heartbreak, through every Thanksgiving dinner where I was more furniture than family. Today, I slipped it into the pocket of my coat. The subway ride felt endless. Around me, people scrolled through their phones, headphones in, eyes glazed with routine. I stared at my reflection in the glass. My face looked calm, but I knew the storm swirling inside. Would Grandpa's will erase me the way my family always had? Or would it prove what he'd whispered in those quiet afternoons under the maple tree, that I mattered, even if no one else believed it? When I reached the lawyer's office, I paused outside the building, staring up at its stone facade. I could almost picture Grandpa walking in, hat in hand, nodding politely to the receptionist. My chest tightened. This wasn't just business. This was a final conversation with the only person who had ever made me feel like more than a shadow. Inside, I sat down in the waiting room, smoothing my skirt over my knees. I tried to breathe steadily, but my thoughts kept spiraling. I remembered one of the last conversations I'd had with Grandpa. I'd been doubting myself, frustrated with my writing, ready to throw everything away. He had leaned close and said, "Ella, knowledge is the only treasure no one can steal. Fill your mind, and you'll never be empty." Those words had carried me through so many lonely nights, and now, sitting there with my family's whispers floating around me, I felt them again, firm, grounding. I closed my eyes, hand resting on my pocket where the coin was, and thought, whatever happens, I will walk through this day with him by my side. When I walked into the conference room, the air shifted. My relatives were already there. My parents, a few cousins, and Lydia, glowing as always in a tailored suit. She didn't even look up from her phone when I entered. My mother's lips tightened, as if my very presence was an inconvenience. My father gave me the kind of nod you'd give a stranger in passing. Nothing more. I sat at the far end of the table, smoothing the hem of my dress, pretending I didn't notice the glances. I've learned over the years that silence is its own kind of armor. But still, the weight of their judgment pressed against me. One cousin leaned over to Lydia, whispering loudly enough for me to hear. "She actually showed up?" Lydia smirked. "Of course she did. She always thinks she's part of this." The laughter that followed was quiet but sharp, cutting through me like glass. I kept my eyes fixed on the polished wood of the table, but inside, I drifted back to another moment. Lydia's high school graduation. The gymnasium was packed, banners hanging from the rafters, the crowd roaring with pride. She walked across the stage to thunderous applause, bouquets waiting for her in every hand. I had been 15 then, standing at the edge of the crowd, clutching a small bouquet I had bought with my babysitting money. I remember trying to push through to give it to her, but by the time I reached her, she was already surrounded, her arms full of roses and lilies. When I handed her the simple daisies, she laughed and said, "Thanks, Ella. Maybe next time you'll aim a little higher." Everyone else laughed with her. I'd stood there, burning, shrinking. But then Grandpa appeared at my side. He didn't scold anyone. He just placed his hand on my shoulder and whispered, "The brightest stars are the ones we can't always see, Ella. Don't ever forget that." His voice was with me again now, echoing through the years as I sat among relatives who never saw me. I straightened my shoulders, refusing to let their whispers define me. The door opened, and Mr. Barnes entered with a folder tucked under his arm. The chatter faded instantly, the room falling into expectant silence. My heart thudded in my chest. This was the moment, and though I felt small, I also felt ready. As the lawyer shuffled his papers, my mind wandered back to a place I hadn't thought about in years. Grandpa's workshop. It wasn't a grand space, just a converted shed at the back of his property, but to me it felt like stepping into another world. The walls were lined with shelves of books and jars filled with tiny screws, gears, and springs. The air always smelled of oil and old wood, and the ticking of clocks filled every corner. Some ticked fast, others slow, each one marking time in its own rhythm. I used to sit cross-legged on the floor, watching him bend over his workbench with a magnifying glass strapped to his head, hands steady and deliberate. One afternoon, when I was about 10, I grew impatient. I wanted him to hurry, to fix the clock so we could go inside and have dinner. "Why does it take so long, Grandpa?" I had whined, crossing my arms. He looked up at me with those kind, amused eyes and said, "Because time teaches us patience, Ella. Every gear has its place, every piece must fit just right. If you rush, it all falls apart." I rolled my eyes back then, not really understanding. But he smiled and placed a small brass gear in my hand. "This little piece may look unimportant, but without it, the whole clock stops. People are like that too. Don't ever believe you don't matter just because others can't see your place in the whole." I remember staring at that gear in my palm, its weight heavier than it should have been. It was a lesson I didn't fully grasp until years later. Until moments like this, when I sat in a room with people who dismissed me, yet I knew deep down I was still part of something bigger. In that workshop, under the glow of a single hanging light, Grandpa taught me more than how to fix clocks. He taught me how to wait, how to believe that silence, patience, and steady work had value, even if the world overlooked them. And now, sitting in the lawyer's office, the ticking of a clock on the wall seemed louder than ever. I pressed my hand against my pocket where the coin rested, grounding myself. Grandpa's wisdom lived there in every beat of silence. I lifted my chin. Whatever the will revealed, I would face it with the patience he had taught me. The ticking of the office clock faded into another memory, one I had tried not to revisit too often. The hospital room. The first time I walked in, the smell of antiseptic clung to the air, sharp and unforgiving. Machines beeped softly, measuring the time he had left in heartbeats and breaths. Grandpa lay in the bed, his skin pale, his once strong hands now thin and spotted. But when he looked at me, his eyes were still the same, clear, steady, full of warmth that even illness couldn't dim. I remember sitting at his bedside, clutching his hand as if I could keep him anchored to the earth a little longer. Lydia had come earlier that day, a quick visit between fittings and interviews, dropping off flowers before rushing back out. My parents hovered, whispering to doctors, talking about practical matters. But Grandpa wanted none of that when I was there. He only wanted to talk. "Ella," he said, his voice a whisper yet somehow firm, "you must carry the light forward." I frowned, tears burning in my eyes. "What light, Grandpa? I don't have any." He smiled, a tired but knowing smile. "You do. It's not the kind that blinds a room, but the kind that steadies it. The kind people turn to when the noise fades. One day, you'll understand." He reached beneath his pillow and pulled out something small, wrapped in a handkerchief. With trembling fingers, he pressed it into my palm. When I unwrapped it, I found a tiny brass key, old and slightly tarnished, with delicate engravings along the shaft. "This opens more than you think," he whispered. "Keep it safe. When the time is right, you'll know where it belongs." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but his eyelids grew heavy. I kissed his forehead, the tears finally spilling, and whispered, "I'll keep it safe, I promise." That was the last real conversation we ever had. Days later, he was gone, and though the house filled with people mourning, bringing casseroles and flowers, I felt utterly alone. The key stayed in my jewelry box, untouched but never forgotten. Now, sitting in the lawyer's office with that same key tucked deep inside my bag, I felt its weight again, heavier than any jewel Lydia had ever worn. I reached down, brushing my fingers against the leather of my purse, almost expecting Grandpa's voice to guide me. Across the table, Lydia was laughing quietly at something on her phone, her legs crossed elegantly, as if this day was nothing more than a formality. My mother whispered instructions to my father, already planning how to secure whatever assets they assumed would go to Lydia. No one looked at me. But I knew deep inside that Grandpa hadn't forgotten me. He had trusted me with something no one else even knew existed. That key wasn't just metal, it was a reminder, a promise, a burden, and a gift all at once. The lawyer cleared his throat, calling the room to order. The shuffle of papers, the anticipation, the heavy silence, it all felt like the air before a storm. I closed my hand over the coin in my pocket and thought of the key resting in my bag. Two small objects, almost worthless to anyone else. Yet together they held the story of who I was to my grandfather. And as Mr. Barnes looked up at the family with calm, professional eyes, I straightened my back and lifted my chin. I wasn't here to beg or to hope for scraps. I was here because Marcus Harrison had asked me, in his own quiet way, to be present. Whatever words were about to be read, I would carry them. For him. For me. For the silence that had always been my strength. The conference room grew still as Mr. Barnes adjusted his glasses and placed the folder on the table. The polished wood reflected the papers like a mirror, and in that reflection I saw our family sitting together, yet miles apart. The air was heavy with anticipation, the kind that makes your throat dry and your pulse race. Lydia finally set down her phone, crossing her arms with the quiet confidence of someone who already believed the outcome belonged to her. My mother smoothed her pearl necklace, her lips pressed into a tight smile, as if rehearsing gratitude for the wealth she assumed would funnel straight to her favorite daughter. My father leaned back, his expression unreadable, but his eyes flickering now and then toward Lydia, never toward me. And there I was, at the far end of the table, my hands folded tightly in my lap, the coin pressing into my palm like an anchor. The faint ticking of the office clock on the wall reminded me of Grandpa's workshop, his words about patience. But patience was hard to come by in that moment. I could feel the unspoken verdict hanging in the air. Ella is the outsider. Ella will leave with nothing. Their certainty burned hotter than words ever could. "Mr. Barnes cleared his throat, glancing around the room. "Thank you all for being here today," he began. His voice was calm, steady, professional. "We are gathered to read the last will and testament of Marcus Harrison." At the sound of my grandfather's name, my chest tightened. A wave of grief rushed back, sharper than I expected. I wanted to close my eyes, to hear his voice instead of this sterile legal one. But I forced myself to stay present, to hold on. My mother leaned toward Lydia, whispering, "Just listen, this won't take long." They both smiled faintly, as if sharing a private joke. I caught the look, but I didn't flinch. I thought back to the last time I had seen Grandpa's handwriting. He had left me a note once, tucked into a book he lent me. "The world will not always clap for you, Ella, but that doesn't mean you aren't worthy of applause." I kept that note pressed inside the book for years, pulling it out on nights when the silence of being overlooked became unbearable. Now I wondered if his will would echo those words, or if it would be just another reminder of my place in this family. Mr. Barnes opened the folder, his fingers sliding across the crisp edges of the documents. He looked up at us once more, his gaze settling briefly on me, as though acknowledging the storm I was bracing myself against. The room seemed to hold its breath. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner, the shuffle of someone's shoe against the carpet, Lydia's impatient sigh. My own heartbeat thudded in my ears, steady but too loud. In that moment, I realized something. No matter what the will revealed, I was already standing in a truth larger than inheritance. Grandpa had given me something no signature or fortune could take away, his belief in me. And whether or not the others saw it, I carried it with me into this moment. Still, as the lawyer began to read, I leaned forward, every nerve alive, waiting for the storm to break. Mr. Barnes adjusted his glasses again and began to read. His voice was measured, almost clinical, yet each word landed with the weight of a verdict. "To my beloved granddaughter, Lydia Harrison." The room seemed to exhale all at once. My mother straightened proudly, my father's lips curved into the faintest smile, and Lydia tilted her chin higher as though she had known all along. "I leave the Harrison Lake estate, the summer home where so many of our family memories were made, along with the adjoining property and its furnishings. I also leave to her a portion of my financial assets, to be managed at her discretion, and several personal heirlooms that I know she will appreciate." I watched Lydia's smile widen as she crossed her legs, utterly composed, basking in the recognition. The cousins exchanged approving glances, murmuring softly as if the natural order of things had been confirmed. The lake estate. That sprawling home with the wraparound porch and the dock where we used to fish. I could still see the sunlight on the water, hear the laughter of family gatherings echoing across the yard. I remembered running barefoot through the grass, always trailing behind Lydia, who sparkled even then. That house was more than property. It was a symbol of belonging. And now, officially, it was hers. I sat quietly, the coin still pressed between my fingers under the table. My face remained calm, but inside something twisted. I told myself I hadn't expected much. My mother's warning had prepared me for this moment, hadn't it? Yet hearing the words aloud, watching my sister receive what I once thought of as ours, not hers alone, pierced deeper than I cared to admit. Mr. Barnes continued. "Additionally to Lydia, I leave certain investment accounts and securities as detailed in this document." The numbers, though not spoken aloud, filled the room like invisible confetti, showering her with privilege and security. Lydia didn't bother to hide her satisfaction. She glanced in my direction, her eyes gleaming as if to say, "See, it's as it should be." My parents whispered to each other, relief written across their faces. This was what they wanted. The wealth, the status, the property, all flowing neatly into the hands of the daughter they celebrated. For them, it meant security. For me, it meant erasure. I thought of Grandpa, sitting with me on the back steps of that same lake house, his arm around my shoulders. "Not everything that matters can be seen, Ella," he had told me one summer night as fireflies danced around us. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Those words came back to me now, steadying me. Because as much as this moment stung, I could still feel his presence, reminding me that what I carried couldn't be measured in square footage or bank accounts. Still, I won't lie, it hurt. Sitting there, listening to the applause Lydia didn't even need to earn, while my place at the table grew smaller and smaller, was a wound only silence could contain. Mr. Barnes paused, giving the family a moment to absorb the news. Lydia basked in the attention. My mother beamed, my father nodded with approval. And I simply sat there, waiting, bracing for whatever came next. Because deep down, I knew Grandpa wouldn't have brought me here just to remind me of my invisibility. There had to be something more, and the weight of that hope was almost heavier than the silence itself. Mr. Barnes took a sip of water, turned the page, and let the room settle. The air was thick with satisfaction, at least for my parents and Lydia. For them, the story was already written. Lydia the star, Ella the shadow. But then his voice cut through the silence. And now, to my granddaughter, Ella Harrison. For a moment, no one moved. My heart thudded so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. My mother stiffened. Lydia's confident smile faltered just slightly, but she quickly recovered, arching a brow as if to say, "What could he possibly have left you?" Mr. Barnes continued. His words were careful, deliberate. To Ella, I leave full ownership of Harrison Industries, the company I built from the ground up, including its holdings, assets, and intellectual property. This also includes my shares and investments valued at approximately $58 million. The room erupted in stunned silence. I felt the breath catch in my throat. The words seemed unreal, echoing in the air, refusing to land. Harrison Industries, $58 million. It sounded like another language, something too big, too distant, to ever belong to me. Lydia let out a sharp laugh, the kind that wasn't laughter at all but disbelief. "What? That can't be right." She turned to my parents. "There has to be a mistake." My mother's face drained of color. My father leaned forward in his chair, eyes narrowing on the lawyer as if sheer willpower could change the words he had spoken. But Mr. Barnes didn't falter. He read on, his tone unwavering. "Furthermore, I leave to Ella all related patents, real estate connected to the company, and full authority to determine its future." The weight of the words pressed down on me. I wasn't sure if I could even move. My palms were damp, the coin still clutched between my fingers as if tethering me to reality. Grandpa hadn't just left me something small, something symbolic. He had left me everything. I glanced at my sister. Her face was frozen, eyes wide, lips parted. For the first time in my life, Lydia was speechless. My mother finally broke the silence, her voice trembling. "Mr. Barnes, surely this is some sort of clerical error? Marcus would never—" But he held up a hand firm. "There is no error. Mr. Harrison was of sound mind and body when this will was drafted. I oversaw the signing myself." A hum filled my ears as if the room had shrunk and I was trapped inside a bell. My chest rose and fell, but each breath felt shallow, uncertain. This couldn't be real. This wasn't my story. I was the forgotten one, the invisible one. And yet here I was, being handed a legacy larger than I could have ever imagined. I thought of Grandpa's hand on mine in the hospital, his whisper about carrying the light. I thought of the key he pressed into my palm, the coin he'd given me as a child. Suddenly, it all began to connect. He had seen me all along. Not for what I wasn't, but for what I was. As the weight of his trust sank in, I sat taller, though my hands still trembled. I didn't speak. I couldn't. Not yet. But I didn't need to. For once the silence was louder than anything else in the room. "Mr. Barnes turned another page, and the sound of the paper crackling was the only thing breaking the silence. His eyes scanned the lines, and then his voice softened, as if the words themselves carried a weight beyond legal formality. "In my own words," he read, "I want my family to understand why my decisions may come as a surprise. I have loved each of you in my own way, but love is not always equal in expression. To Lydia, I gave applause. To Ella, I gave presence." I felt the air leave my lungs. My grandfather's voice, carried through the lawyer's tone, filled the room as though he were sitting there with us. He went on. "Lydia has always been celebrated, and she deserves admiration for her accomplishments. But applause is loud and fleeting. It comes and goes with the seasons. Ella gave me something I never received from anyone else: silence. And in that silence, true companionship." I stared at the polished wood of the table, my vision blurring. Around me I could hear the faint shuffle of my relatives, but none of them dared to interrupt. Mr. Barnes continued. "Ella never asked for recognition. She never needed the spotlight. Instead, she sat with me in the garden, turned the pages of books, listened as the clocks ticked, and reminded me that the world could still be soft even when age made it harsh. In her quiet way, she gave me peace. Tears stung my eyes. Those afternoons came back to me in vivid detail. Me at 12, curled up with a book while Grandpa hummed softly beside me. The smell of tobacco, the sound of cicadas in summer, the feeling of being seen without having to perform. The lawyer paused, then read the next line slowly, deliberately. I leave my company and my fortune to Ella, not because she is the loudest or the most praised, but because she understands the value of what is unseen. She knows patience. She knows loyalty. She knows how to carry something precious without demanding it shine for others. These are the qualities a true steward must have. I swallowed hard, my throat tight, the words wrapped around me like a blanket and a burden all at once. He hadn't chosen me by mistake. He had chosen me because he believed I could carry more than I ever thought I could. Across the table, Lydia shifted in her chair, her composure cracking. My mother's jaw was clenched, her face pale. My father shook his head slightly, as though he couldn't reconcile the man he thought he knew with the will being read before him. But I sat very still, hands trembling in my lap, because while the room around me seemed to collapse under the weight of confusion and resentment, I felt Grandpa lifting me up, word by word. Mr. Barnes's voice grew gentler as he concluded this section. Ella may never seek the spotlight, but she is the one I trust to protect the flame of our family when the lights dim. That is why this legacy is hers. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence was so thick I could hear the clock ticking again, steady and patient, just as Grandpa had taught me. And for the first time in my life, that silence didn't make me feel invisible. It made me feel seen. The silence shattered like glass. Lydia was the first to speak, her voice sharp, slicing through the air. This is absurd. Ella, in charge of Harrison Industries? She doesn't know the first thing about running a company. Grandpa must have been confused. Her words tumbled over each other, louder with every breath, her composure dissolving before my eyes. My mother quickly chimed in, clutching at her pearls as if they could anchor her. Mr. Barnes, I demand an explanation. Marcus adored Lydia, everyone knows that. He would never put such responsibility on Ella. She isn't capable. The word incapable stung, but I forced myself to remain still, to let their fury swirl around me without being pulled in. Mr. Barnes kept his voice steady. Mrs. Harrison, I can assure you your father was perfectly sound of mind when this document was signed. He was deliberate, thoughtful, and clear in his wishes. My father leaned forward, his jaw tight. Marcus was old. He could be manipulated. Maybe Ella... That was too much. My voice, quiet but firm, finally broke through. I never asked for this. The words trembled, but they were true. I never asked for money or titles or control. All I ever wanted was to be seen, and he saw me. The room froze for a heartbeat. Lydia's eyes narrowed, her mouth twisting. Don't play the victim, Ella. You're nothing without this. Don't you see? You're not worthy of it. Her words echoed the ones I had heard all my life, but instead of sinking, I felt something steady rise inside me. I thought of Grandpa's workshop, the ticking clocks, the brass gear in my hand. I thought of the hospital room, his whisper about carrying the light, and suddenly, I wasn't afraid of their scorn anymore. I don't need to prove my worth to you, I said softly. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Grandpa knew me. He trusted me. That's enough. For once, no one had a reply. Lydia scoffed and turned away, her fingers gripping her phone like it could rescue her. My mother muttered under her breath, refusing to look at me. My father stared at the table, his face unreadable. And in the center of it all, I sat quietly, my hand brushing the coin in my pocket, the key resting in my bag. My grandfather's presence filled the silence between their accusations and my calm. The storm raged around me, but inside, I felt a strange stillness. It was the first time in my life that their voices no longer defined me. The lawyer's voice faded into silence, and for a long moment no one moved. Then, as if a dam had broken, the room filled with accusations. You manipulated him, Lydia spat, her face twisted in anger. You must have whispered in his ear, made him believe you were some kind of saint while the rest of us carried the family. Her words stung, but I didn't flinch. My fingers brushed the coin in my pocket, grounding me. My mother leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "Ella, this isn't you. You never cared about the business. You barely care about your own life. Marcus was old and frail. You took advantage of his weakness, and now you sit here acting innocent." I felt their words land like stones, but I refused to let them bury me. For years, I had absorbed their judgment in silence, shrinking under its weight. Not anymore. Mr. Barnes cleared his throat. "I must remind you that Mr. Harrison was evaluated by both his physician and myself before signing these documents. His mind was perfectly clear. There is no question of manipulation." But my father's voice rumbled low and bitter. "You've always been the fragile one, Ella. The quiet one. He must have felt sorry for you." I met his eyes for the first time in years. "He didn't pity me," I said, my voice calm but firm. "He understood me." The room fell quiet again, but only for a breath. Lydia slammed her hand on the table. "This is a joke! I built a career, I made a name for myself, and for what? For him to hand everything to you? You don't deserve it." Her words echoed like every insult, every dismissal I'd carried since childhood. But something inside me shifted. I thought of Grandpa in his workshop, the brass gear in my hand. I thought of the hospital, his whisper, "Carry the light forward." "I never asked for any of this," I said softly. "All I ever did was love him. That's the difference." My mother scoffed. "Love? Don't be dramatic, Ella. You barely existed in this family. He gave you pity, not love." I let her words hang in the air. Then I leaned forward, my voice steady. "You can believe whatever you need to, but I know the truth. He trusted me, and I don't need your approval to honor that." Silence pressed down again. My family's faces hardened, unwilling to concede, but unable to argue against the evidence written in my grandfather's own hand. Mr. Barnes broke the tension. "Mr. Harrison was clear in his wishes. The will stands. This is not a matter of opinion, it is law." I took a deep breath, letting the weight of it all settle. For the first time, I realized I didn't need to fight them. Their anger wasn't mine to carry. I looked at Lydia, whose eyes burned with fury, and whispered, almost to myself, "I don't need the spotlight. I never did. What I have is enough." And with those words, I felt something shift inside me. Not triumph, not revenge, just freedom. For the first time, their voices didn't drown me. My silence was stronger. By the time I left the lawyer's office, the sun was already beginning to sink, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson. I stepped into the cool evening air, my body heavy but my mind strangely clear. The shouting, the accusations, the bitter faces of my family, all of it stayed behind in that room. What I carried with me now was Grandpa's voice, his trust, and the weight of a key that suddenly seemed to burn through the fabric of my bag. I didn't go home. Instead, I turned the wheel of my car toward the hills outside the city, toward the place I hadn't visited since his funeral. The old cabin on the ridge. Grandpa's refuge. My refuge. The road was long and winding, lined with trees that had begun to shed their leaves. The autumn air was sharp, filling my lungs with something purer than anything I had felt in weeks. I rolled the window down, letting the wind tangle my hair, and for the first time since the reading of the will, I allowed myself to breathe. As the miles slipped past, memories rose unbidden. Summer mornings on that porch, when Grandpa would sip his coffee while I scribbled stories in a notebook. Winter evenings when the fire crackled and he read aloud from his favorite books, his voice steady and warm. That cabin had been more than a house. It was a sanctuary, a place where the noise of the world fell away and silence became a gift. The road narrowed, gravel crunching beneath the tires as I turned onto the long driveway. My chest tightened when the cabin came into view. Weathered wood, a sagging roofline, windows smudged with dust. But to me, it looked like home. The kind of home I had never felt in my parents' house. I parked and sat there for a moment, staring at the front porch. The silence was thick, but not empty. It was the same silence I had shared with Grandpa countless times, when words weren't needed and presence was enough. Finally, I stepped out, my shoes sinking into the soft earth. The air smelled of pine and damp leaves. As I climbed the porch steps, they creaked under my weight, the sound familiar and comforting. I reached for the door handle, but my hand stopped halfway. Instead, I slipped the small brass key from my bag. Its weight was heavier now, meaningful in a way I had only begun to understand. I slid it into the lock. The mechanism turned smoothly, as if it had been waiting for me all along. The door opened with a low groan, and I stepped inside. The air was cool and musty, but beneath that was something unmistakable, the faint trace of Grandpa's presence, as if the walls themselves remembered him. Dust floated in the beams of late afternoon light cutting through the shutters. The furniture was covered with sheets, the shelves still lined with books. Everything was exactly as he had left it. I stood in the center of the room, my hand still clutching the key, and let the quiet settle over me. For the first time in days, my heart didn't race. My breathing slowed. I felt steady. This cabin wasn't just a building. It was a message. Grandpa had left me the company, the money, the title, but this place was the true inheritance, a space where silence wasn't punishment but power, a reminder that I wasn't invisible here. I lowered myself into the old armchair by the window, the one where he used to sit with his books, and watched as the last light of day poured across the floor. My eyes closed, and I whispered softly, "I'm here, Grandpa. I found my way back." And for the first time since losing him, I didn't feel alone. The cabin was quiet except for the faint creak of the floor beneath my feet as I wandered through the rooms. I moved slowly, touching the backs of chairs, brushing my fingers along the spines of books, letting the memories seep back into me like water into dry soil. Everything felt suspended in time, as though Grandpa had only stepped out for a walk and might return at any moment. In the corner of the study beneath the window that overlooked the hills, I saw it. A wooden trunk. Its surface was scarred and faded, the brass hinges dulled with age. I remembered it from my childhood, though he had never let me open it. "Some things must wait for the right time," he had once said when I asked. At the time, I thought he was just being mysterious. Now I understood. My hands trembled as I pulled the trunk into the light. I knelt down, brushing away a thin layer of dust, and there it was, the keyhole. My heart skipped as I reached into my bag and took out the small brass key. It slid in perfectly, turning with a soft click. The lid creaked open, releasing a breath of air that smelled faintly of cedar and ink. Inside lay carefully folded blankets, a few books, a bundle of old letters tied with string. And on top, resting as if it had been waiting only for me, was a leather-bound journal. I lifted it gently, my fingertips tracing the worn edges. The cover was cracked, but the pages inside were neat, filled with his handwriting, precise, steady, familiar. My throat tightened as I opened it and began to read. "This journal is for Ella. If you are reading this, then I am gone and my voice must find you another way." I pressed a hand to my mouth. My eyes blurred, but I forced myself to keep reading. "I want you to know that your presence in my life was my greatest comfort. The world celebrated Lydia, and I loved her for who she is. But you, Ella, you gave me something no one else did. You gave me silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of peace. In you, I saw a soul who understood the spaces between words, the moments between heartbeats." Tears slipped down my cheeks as I turned the pages. "I left you the company because I believe you can protect it, not with noise or ego, but with patience and thought. Money and titles will test you, but remember, they are not your worth. Your worth is in the way you listen, the way you see what others ignore. That is why I trust you." I closed the journal against my chest, rocking back on my heels. His words filled the emptiness I had carried for so long, sealing wounds my family had carved into me over the years. He hadn't just remembered me, he had understood me. When I finally set the journal aside, I reached deeper into the trunk. Beneath the letters and books was a small framed photograph. My breath caught. It was of us. Me at 8 years old holding a book, and Grandpa sitting beside me, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. We weren't smiling for the camera. We were simply together, present, at peace. I placed the photo on the desk beside the journal and sank into his old chair. The late afternoon light spilled through the window, bathing the room in gold. For the first time since his death, I felt him close, not as a memory, but as a presence. I whispered into the stillness, my voice breaking, "Thank you for seeing me, Grandpa." And in that moment, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like home. The sun was low by the time I closed the journal. A hush had settled over the cabin, the kind of stillness that doesn't demand anything from you. It simply allows you to breathe. I set the worn leather book on the desk beside the framed photograph and leaned back in Grandpa's chair, letting the weight of his words wash over me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting to be acknowledged. I didn't feel invisible. I felt steady, grounded in the quiet truth he had left behind. He had given me the company, yes, but more than that, he had given me this, a way to see myself without needing the approval of anyone else. Through the dusty window, the light shifted, turning the room golden. I rose slowly and walked to the window, resting my hand against the cool glass. The hills rolled out in front of me, painted in the fading glow of late afternoon. For so long, I had thought of silence as a punishment. But standing there, I realized it was a gift. I pulled the old chair closer to the window and sat down, watching as the light softened into evening. I could almost hear his voice beside me. Imperfect silence is still stronger than perfect noise. A small smile tugged at my lips. For once, the tears that came weren't bitter. They were gentle, almost cleansing. I whispered into the fading light, "I understand now, Grandpa. The path you wanted me to walk, it begins here." I stayed like that for a while, just breathing, just being. No one to interrupt, no voices to cut me down, no comparisons. Only me, and the memory of the man who had seen me when no one else did. Finally, as the last rays began to slip behind the horizon, I stood and moved toward the door. My hand brushed the frame of the photograph on the way out. Grandpa's eyes seemed to follow me, steady, certain. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked beneath my feet, familiar and comforting. The world outside was bathed in amber light, the kind of glow that makes everything look softer, kinder. The air smelled of pine and earth, cool against my skin. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. For the first time, I wasn't running from my family's rejection. I wasn't shrinking in the shadow of Lydia's success. I was standing in my own place on solid ground, with the silence as my companion. I looked out over the valley, my hands resting on the porch rail, and let a smile spread across my face. "This is the beginning," I whispered. Not for anyone else to hear, just for me. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the sound like a quiet answer. As the light wrapped around me, I stepped down from the porch and onto the grass, feeling the earth firm beneath my shoes. It was as if the world itself was inviting me forward. For the first time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt illuminated, not by applause, not by recognition, but by the quiet strength of being seen by the one person who had mattered most. And as the last of the sunlight faded into twilight, I walked toward it, carrying his silence as my light. The first night I spent in the cabin was heavier than I expected. After the sun disappeared behind the hills, the silence grew deeper, wrapping itself around the wooden walls like a blanket. I built a fire in the old stone hearth, the flames crackling, filling the space with warmth. But even with the glow of the fire, I couldn't escape the truth. I was alone. Not the kind of alone you feel when you walk into a party and no one sees you. This was different. This was the kind of alone that sinks into your bones when the voices you grew up with are gone, when you realize that no matter what you do, the family you longed for may never embrace you. I sat by the fire with the journal on my lap, running my fingers across the leather cover. His words echoed in my head, steady and kind. "You gave me silence, Ella." That was enough for him. But was it enough for me? I wanted to believe it was. I wanted to let his trust be the anchor that kept me steady. Yet in the quiet hours of that night, when the fire burned low and the wind whispered through the trees outside, doubt crept in. Would I always carry the shadow of Lydia's voice, the echo of my mother's dismissal, the weight of my father's indifference? I closed my eyes and leaned back in the chair, listening to the logs shift in the fireplace. Memories rose uninvited. The laughter at family dinners that had never included me, birthdays where my accomplishments went unnoticed, the countless times I had been compared and found lacking. They crowded the room like ghosts, reminding me of all I had lost and never truly had. For a moment, I felt the sting of resentment, not toward Grandpa but toward them, the people who should have been my home but never were. I whispered into the empty room, "Why wasn't I enough for you?" The words broke in the air and fell into the fire. But then, almost as if in answer, my eyes drifted to the photograph on the desk. Me and Grandpa, side by side, no performance, no applause, just presence. And I realized something I had never allowed myself to see before. Family is not always defined by blood. Family is defined by those who see you, who choose you, who stand beside you when the world looks away. I pressed the journal against my chest and took a deep breath. I couldn't change my parents. I couldn't rewrite Lydia's heart, but I could choose what kind of family I wanted to build for myself. Maybe it would be small. Maybe it would just be me and the memories for now. But even that was a beginning. The fire crackled softly, the warmth seeping into me, pushing back the cold edges of loneliness. I whispered, "You gave me more than silence, Grandpa. You gave me courage." And for the first time in a long while, I believed it. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds outside the window and the soft glow of sunlight spilling across the wooden floor. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then the smell of ash from the fireplace and the familiar weight of the journal on the desk reminded me. I was in the cabin, in his space. And I wasn't just a visitor anymore. I was the one he had trusted to keep it alive. I made a cup of coffee on the old stove and carried it to the desk, sitting down with the journal. My hands trembled as I opened it again, the leather cracking softly as though it had been waiting for years to be touched. The entry I turned to was dated 2 months before he died. Family can be a heavy word. Sometimes it binds us. Sometimes it bruises us. I know my daughter and her husband will never understand Ella the way I do. They value noise, accomplishment, spectacle. But Ella, she carries a quieter strength. I pray she never doubts it. I pray she finds a family, whether by blood or by choice, who will honor her silence the way I do. I set the journal down, my chest tightening. Tears filled my eyes, but not from sadness. This time it was recognition. He had seen my struggle even then. He had known what I carried, the loneliness that came from never quite belonging. And still, he believed I would find my way. I turned the page, hungry for more of his words. Love, Ella, is not measured in applause or inheritance. Love is presence. It is the willingness to sit beside someone without needing to fix them or change them. It is showing up in the ordinary moments, not just the celebrations. That is the love you gave me, and the love I hope you seek in your life. I pressed my palm against the ink as if I could feel the warmth of his hand through the words. Presence. That was what I had always longed for from my parents, from Lydia. A kind of love that didn't need performance, didn't come with conditions. As I read, something inside me shifted. For so long I had been chasing their approval, hoping that one day my mother would look at me with pride, that my father would see me as more than fragile, that Lydia would treat me as more than an afterthought. But Grandpa was right. That kind of love had never been theirs to give. And maybe that was all right. Because love wasn't supposed to feel like begging. Love was what he had given me every summer afternoon under the maple tree, every quiet evening in the cabin, every gentle word reminding me I was enough. Love was what I could now give myself, the permission to stop waiting for acceptance that would never come. I closed the journal for a moment, staring out the window at the hills rolling endlessly into the horizon. The air was cool, filled with the scent of pine, and it struck me how alive I felt in that silence. I whispered softly, maybe family isn't about where you come from. Maybe it's about who you become with the people who choose to see you. When I reopened the journal, another entry caught my eye. If Ella is reading this, I want her to remember one thing. Silence is not emptiness. It is the soil where love can grow if you let it. Do not be afraid of being alone, child. Alone is where you will learn who deserves to walk beside you. I wiped my cheeks, smiling through the tears. His words were not just comfort, they were a map, a guide for the years ahead. For the first time, I let myself imagine what life could look like beyond my family's shadow. Friends who valued me, relationships where I didn't have to shrink, a community built not on obligation but on presence. Maybe it would take time. Maybe it would be small at first, but it would be real. I closed the journal gently, holding it to my chest. Thank you, I whispered. Not just to him but to myself, for staying, for listening, for not giving up on the possibility of love. And in that quiet cabin, with the morning sun spilling over me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not just hope, belonging. It was 3 days before I heard from my family again. The phone rang while I was sitting on the porch of the cabin, the journal open in my lap, the hills stretching endlessly in front of me. I knew the number before I even picked it up. Ella! My mother's voice came sharp and clipped. We need to talk. Your sister is distraught. This entire situation is humiliating for her, for all of us. You must reconsider." I closed the journal slowly, keeping my tone steady. "Reconsider what?" "Giving it all back," she said, as though it were obvious. "The company, the money. Lydia deserves it. She's the one prepared for this. You were never meant for responsibilities like these." I sat very still, the weight of her words pressing against me like they always had. But this time, they didn't sink in. Instead, I looked out at the golden light spreading across the valley and realized how different I felt here, how different I was now. "Mom," I said softly, "you're right about one thing. I was never meant for what you wanted me to be, but Grandpa saw something in me that you never cared to notice, and I won't give that back just to make you comfortable." There was a pause, the sound of her breath sharp on the line. "Don't be foolish, Ella. You'll regret this. Without us, you'll have nothing." I almost laughed. The bitterness in her words no longer had the power to wound me the way it once did. "I already had nothing with you," I said quietly. "And somehow I survived. This isn't about money or status. This is about honoring the only person who ever believed in me. I won't betray him." I ended the call before she could respond. My hand trembled slightly as I set the phone down, but it wasn't fear. It was release. Later that night, Lydia sent a message. It was short, cold, and cutting. "Enjoy your little empire, Ella. Don't come crawling to me when it crumbles." I stared at the screen, then deleted the message without replying. For years, I had tried to bridge the gap between us, tried to love her enough to make her love me back. But love isn't meant to be begged for. Grandpa had taught me that. I stepped outside onto the porch, the night air cool against my skin, the stars scattered bright and clear above the hills. For the first time, I realized that setting boundaries wasn't cruelty. It was survival. It was choosing not to let their voices drown me anymore. The next morning, I wrote a letter, not to them, but to myself. "You are not invisible. You never were. You don't need their approval to exist. You don't need their applause to shine. The love you give, the silence you carry, it's enough. Let go of the family who cannot see you and make room for the family who will." I folded the letter and tucked it inside Grandpa's journal. It wasn't for anyone else to read. It was my promise, my boundary, my line in the sand. As I sat back in the chair by the window, I felt lighter than I ever had before. The ghosts of rejection still lingered, but they no longer haunted me. They were simply memories, chapters I no longer had to reread. I whispered into the empty room, "I forgive you, but I won't follow you anymore." The words settled over me like a blessing, freeing me from years of longing. I rose and opened the front door. The morning sun was spilling across the valley, warm and endless. I stepped out onto the porch, my heart steady, my silence no longer heavy but full of possibility. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for a seat at their table. I was building my own. The days that followed settled into a rhythm I hadn't known I needed. Each morning, I woke to the sound of wind moving through the trees and the faint chorus of birds announcing the dawn. The silence of the cabin, once intimidating, began to feel like an embrace. It wasn't the silence of being ignored, it was the silence of belonging to myself. I started simple. Sweeping the floors, opening the windows, letting the crisp air sweep out the years of dust. I stacked wood by the fireplace and brewed coffee on the old stove. With every small act of care, the cabin felt less like a relic and more like a home. At night, I'd sit by the fire with Grandpa's journal in my lap, reading his words slowly, as if I could stretch them into a conversation. Some passages were practical, notes about the company, about the responsibilities he hoped I would shoulder. Others were deeply personal, reflections on love, patience, and the beauty of a quiet life. Each entry reminded me that I wasn't carrying this alone. He had prepared me in his own way for this very moment. One afternoon, I drove down into town and walked through the small main street, stopping at the bookstore, the cafe, the hardware shop. Faces I didn't know smiled at me, nodding in the easy way of people who had lived there their whole lives. It was a different kind of belonging, unspoken, unforced. For the first time, I thought, maybe I could build something here. As the sun set that evening, I sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, watching the hills darken into silhouettes. The air smelled of pine and smoke from the fire inside. I whispered into the fading light, "This is where it begins, Grandpa. My life, my family, my peace." And for once, I believed it. In the weeks that followed, I began to understand what Grandpa had been teaching me all along. Silence wasn't emptiness, it was strength. Each morning I walked the trails behind the cabin, listening to the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, the wind rushing through the branches, the heartbeat of the earth steady and constant. The quiet no longer reminded me of what I lacked, it reminded me of what I carried inside. At the library in town, I found myself drawn to the history section, running my hands across spines of books he once loved. I spoke to the librarian, a kind woman with silver hair, who remembered Marcus Harrison not as a businessman, but as the gentleman who always took time to listen. Her words made me smile. That was the legacy I wanted to carry. Not the wealth, not the company, but the art of listening, of being present. Sometimes at night I would sit with the journal open on my lap and write my own words alongside his. I wrote about the anger that still flickered, about the sorrow of being cut out by my family, but also about the surprising joy of hearing my own voice in the silence. Page by page, I felt myself growing stronger, not louder, but steadier. I realized I didn't need to fight for recognition anymore. I didn't need to chase after applause. My grandfather had been right. Silence could hold more power than any speech. It could shape a life, guide decisions, even heal old wounds. One evening, as the fire burned low, I whispered into the stillness, "Silence is my strength." The words felt solid, rooted, and in that moment I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. The last morning I wrote in Grandpa's journal. The air was cool and the hills were wrapped in a soft mist. I closed the book and placed it back in the trunk, knowing I didn't need to keep searching for his approval anymore. He had already given it. What I needed now was to live. Standing on the porch, I felt the breeze lift my hair, the quiet steady all around me. I realized the silence I once feared was no longer a void. It was a foundation. It wasn't the absence of love, but the space where love could grow. Grandpa had known that, and now so did I. I looked out at the valley, a smile forming as I whispered, "This is where my story begins." Because here's the truth I want you to carry with you. Silence is not weakness. Silence is power. It's the strength to walk away from voices that diminish you, the courage to stand steady when others shout, the wisdom to know your worth even when no one else sees it. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever been overlooked or underestimated, I want you to know, you are not alone. Your value is not measured by their approval. It lives in the quiet persistence of your heart, in the way you keep going even when no one claps for you. So, as you watch my story, I invite you to reflect on your own. Where in your life have you mistaken silence for emptiness? Where could it become your strength instead? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from, share your own story, and let's build a community where no one has to feel unseen. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe, because together we can turn silence into strength. And remember, your light doesn't need applause to shine.